No, it's okay. We're live now. Hey,
We're live.
and we're live. I know, right? It happens really, really abruptly. Okay, we are here. I am here with my friend and colleague Don Ding. We are here to talk about overwhelm, and specifically when overwhelm becomes toxic. And because you will do a much better job at this than I will, Don, I would like to ask you to introduce yourself to the people who are watching us.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, my name is Don. Some people like to say my full name, Don Ding, but I just go by my first name, Don. I am a life coach. I help professionals multiply their productivity, stress less, and build their dream career. Before this, I was a retail marketing consultant, but I left that about like 2 years ago, and I've been doing this ever since.
Cool. Congratulations. And the profession's glad that you're in it.
Thank you, Todd.
We met in training, right? Hey, you know what? I can talk on behalf of the profession. Why not? Yeah, you and I met in training. We're both coactive trained, and I think that's context. It's just context.
That is how we met, and also Canada, which you can see from Todd's shirt.
Yeah, we're Canadian. That's true.
Wow, a power pose, T pose, Canada. Oh yeah.
That's me. Proudly Canadian. I used to live in your city, Toronto. I am now in Hamilton. You're in Toronto, right?
I am in Toronto. Yeah.
That's what I thought.
Oh, Hamilton. That's like Toronto Junior a little bit.
I know.
That's probably offensive. I'm sorry.
Nah, it's okay. I was, you know what? 25 years I lived in Toronto. Now I'm in Hamilton. Let's talk about overwhelm.
Okay.
So
before we get overwhelmed by other topics.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's like, yeah, exactly. So yeah, let's talk about overwhelm. Specifically, when does overwhelm become toxic? And I like to start these conversations just like by glomming onto a word, just so that we're on the same page. And I think the word that I kind of want to glom onto right now is overwhelm. So when you think overwhelm, and in your practice, like what does overwhelm mean for you?
Now so the way I see it might be a little different from how most people see it. I see overwhelm as a emotion that's meant to send you a protective signal, and it's trying to protect you from taking on too much that you can't handle and then failing and like basically going towards burnout. So at its essence, it's intending to be helpful to you. It's a protective signal. That's how I see it.
Yeah, it sounds like there's some neuroscience in what you're describing as well, right? Like that. This is, whether it's overwhelm, it's sort of a variation on that fight, flight, freeze, like that. That tingly sensation, that right? Sensation. Like that. It's a body sensation. Like you can tell when it's there because something happens. And for me, it's a tightness in my solar plexus. For other people, it's butterflies in the stomach. It might be tightness in the shoulders, but I'm making up that there's something physical.
Oh, yeah, there is. Yeah, for me, it's like a helmet is coming onto my head, weighing me down, or something like that. So very different.
Yeah, right. And I think that's so interesting because it's different for different people, depending on sort of the situation and maybe what has you in that state of overwhelm. Whether maybe it's different for work versus for life versus for family versus for what I guess everything is life. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And actually, before we get too deep, you did tell me to remind you.
I completely forgot. Go for it. Tell us.
I also don't even know if anybody's in the chat, but if anybody's watching live, you can just type any questions or comments you have into the live stream, and we will be able to see it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that reminder, Don. I said that I was going to do it at the top of this, and I completely.
This is why you said, "Please remind me if I forget." I'm like, I could easily forget that too. Yeah,
it's awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah, so that's overwhelm. And then maybe it's also interesting for us to kind of spend a second or two on toxicity, right? Because specifically, it's like when that feeling of overwhelm becomes toxic, and I think you alluded to this too, right? Like you go too far and it becomes it can become burnout, it can become something different and something damaging.
Right. Yeah. And the word toxic is interesting because I actually think there's two very different ways that it can become toxic. Number one, it can be toxic if the part of you that's sending you overwhelmed signals is kind of too extreme and out of touch with reality, meaning that you're not actually overwhelmed, but it's sending you powerful overwhelmed signals. And that's kind of like a toxic version of itself instead of a healthy version. But the second type is when it's sending you a legitimate signal and you're ignoring it. Then that's a different type of toxicity from a different source.
Oh, that's really, really interesting. Because what comes up for me when you describe that, especially the first version, is and I've talked about this too, so I don't think I'm revealing anything that anyone doesn't already know. You know, I lived for a long time in my career with what I didn't realize was chronic anxiety, but was chronic anxiety, and I'm still on that healing journey and probably will be for the rest of my life, which is great, and it's a real privilege to be able to do that. But that overwhelm, when you describe, you know, it's an overreaction to something, that sounds very like the anxiety stories and the anxiety experience that I've right, and for me it would show up in catastrophizing. I am an expert catastrophizer. You know, ask me what the worst case scenario is, and I've probably got 5 thought of before you finish talking. And there's this thing that pops up. There's a phrase that popped up in my particular journey that was really, really helpful, which was, you know, you can't believe everything you think.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. Like there's a story that goes along with that overreaction, with that the alarm feeling that shows up in your body, and it stories, for me anyway, stories are created because, you know, my mind wants to explain the unpleasantness that I'm feeling, so it comes up with something, and the something that it comes up with is, you know, lies.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting. There's actually, I mean, I relate to that maybe in a different way. Was it obvious to you that you were like anxious? Because it wasn't obvious to me that I was anxious.
No.
But I later discovered I was basically like, I don't know if the word chronic is too extreme. I consider myself to have been constantly anxious to some extent, but I didn't realize it. The thing is, the body has ways to defend yourself against yourself. So if you're feeling too anxious, one of the most common defensive tactics is actually, there's only basically 3 things that you could possibly do. You can either avoid it by like procrastinating and distracting yourself with something else. You can numb yourself out and be like, I don't care, and just not feel anything. And then number 3 is like, you try to fix it, you try to control it somehow. It's like, oh, I need to do all this different stuff. So those are the 3 responses. For me, I kind of tended towards avoid it. I'm like, I'm not overwhelmed. I would just, but like, I just play video games, procrastinate super, super hard until the last second where it's like, I need to do it now. And then I get it done.
Yep. Yeah. And yeah, so I like all of those things are extremely relatable to me. And I think that what I wish that I had known at the time was that they were signals and not just and not exactly that, like not coping mechanisms or whatever they happen to be. You know, numbing, yes. You know, beating myself up, like I was an expert at that. You know, in addition to the story of catastrophization, it would also be, you know, if I were stronger, if I were better at this or that or something else, if I weren't deficient, I would be able to survive or thrive in this environment which is causing this overwhelm for whatever reason. And I think like the thing that I'd add to what you said is all of those things are about taking whatever that story is and internalizing it and making it about me, rather than sort of recognizing that there's a whole bunch of stuff going on and some of it is external stimuli.
Oh, like what kind of external stimuli are you talking about?
Okay, so if I think of some of the situations where I experienced some pretty extreme overwhelm, most of them are work related. They aren't all exclusively. They usually were something came up in the context of work that I didn't know how to do. And I didn't think that I was allowed to not know how to do it, because that's the other thing, right? Like the folks that show up, I'm going all over the place in those, but the folks that show up, and at least the folks that I end up talking to, usually, yes, they have some degree of overwhelming anxiety, and they're high performers at the same time. So there's this expectation that they have for themselves, that they're going to be able to do whatever it is that's going to get them through, through the thing. And I think that that's one of the three techniques that you talked about. So, I force myself through it. And oh, Don, I mean, if I had like a dime for like every time I forced myself through an uncomfortable, anxiety inducing moment at work, I wouldn't be rich, but I'd have a lot of dimes.
Yeah, you would. Yeah, you'd
have
be
a lot of dimes.
You'd be able to buy Taylor Swift tickets or something. Yeah,
totally. My desk would be full of dimes, and it was, and I just thought it was me. Like I thought it was me, and I thought I was alone. And that's the thing that I think, if I could go back in time, the thing that I would change would be that. It would be, what if this isn't just me? What if this isn't I'm broken? What if this isn't I'm at fault?
What would that have changed for you?
That's a good question. I'm going to answer it. Because if I go into my Wayback Machine, like once I realized, Don, that what I was experiencing was, whether it's chronic anxiety or acute anxiety, and I don't remember what my doctor called it, but once I realized that that's what it was, I had the opportunity to go back into my past and sort of see, what are the patterns that I had? And certainly, those coping patterns existed as well, like the procrastination, the numbing, the forcing myself through, like all of those things happened. But I also had career markers. Like I used to say, and people who've worked with me have heard me say this 100 times probably, and many years ago, like I mostly didn't last at any job for any more than 4 or 5 years.
Hey, 4 or 5 is not bad.
4 or 5 isn't bad. I'm happy about that. I'm also of a different generation than you are, right? So I have peers who have been in jobs.
I'm like 4 or 5. That's like a record. That's like a world record for Gen Z.
I have peers who are in the same job that they were when they left university. Now, not a lot of them, right? But that's sort of more my parents' generation. But it's not unheard of. It's not completely it's not completely unusual. But yeah, 4 or 5 years in career jumping for me. But the thing is like at the end of those 4 or 5 years, there was always that thing, like that ick, that just felt that, okay, this is terrible. Like there's a misalignment. And what I know now is that misalignment was important.
Oh, you know what this is? This is 2 tectonic plates out of balance, and then there's going to be an earthquake.
Yeah. And I think, if I were like, I love that metaphor, because the thing is I feel like I was slipping and slipping and slipping until eventually what I had was a tsunami.
Yeah.
And then I didn't have a choice, and that was burnout rather than overwhelm. Like that was where anxiety and overwhelm led to burnout, which required a different kind of healing.
Very different. Yeah. Which is technically not the topic, but also something that it seems like we both kind of help people work through. It's such a common workplace problem.
Totally.
So if you guys have questions about that, we can also talk about that another time.
Yeah, for sure. So how about you? Like, what's your, if you don't mind me asking, like I know that like this is I know that this is something you're passionate about. And what I'd really love to know is, how did that passion get awakened in you? Like what's important about this topic for you in your practice?
I think it's important to me. Well, first of all, overwhelm is something that happens to me so often, and kind of like in cycles, that it's I've just become quite acquainted with it now. And I think it's important because I just wish somebody could have like woken me up maybe like a few years earlier than I actually did, and been like, boop, boop, boop. Like something's wrong and you should try to do something about it. And I was just in denial for so long that anything was wrong. Like I was living in constant overwhelm, procrastination, last minute, ultra anxious, like beep, 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 like get it done.
Mhm.
And then like just over and over and over until I did reach burnout. And then I had my own like earthquake tsunami thing. And
Mhm.
I ended up quitting my job.
Mhm.
And I think it's important for people to hear that like overwhelm is basically an early warning sign for burnout.
Mm.
And if you don't do anything about it, it doesn't really get better. It just gets
Yep.
worse.
Yep.
In most cases.
I can attest to that.
Yeah. As long as your job's the same, your responsibilities are the same, it doesn't really get better unless you do something about it.
Mhm.
I never did anything about it until like
Yeah.
until I basically crashed and burned. And then I was like, okay,
Mhm.
now I'll do something about it. But I
Mhm.
wish I did something about it earlier. You know?
Me too. And you know, it's not that the crash and burn didn't result in learning, because it did. Like there was a lot of learning that happened in that space where I was forced to stop. And I think, you know, there's there's that book, and I wish I could remember the author. The Body Keeps the Score. You know, about how sort of trauma
Oh,
and
that's a
right
famous
is
book that I have not read.
exact. I
Yeah.
have read it. I forget the author's name. Someone probably is going to remember it and put it in the chat.
Yeah.
But there, it's you know, largely it's, you know, trauma is built up, right? Like our body hangs on to these things, and at some point, it's, if we think of it in terms of you know, it bubbles over or it boils over. It's actually, I actually like the analogy that we were talking about beforehand, before we turn the cameras on, because you know, if you think of a pot of water on the stove, right, it boils down,
Oh
it
yeah.
boils down, it boils down until there's nothing left, right? And it's like when you're in a state of overwhelm, you've still got some gas in the tank, you've still got some water in the pot, and you've got some choices as a result of that. But once it's all gone, then your choices are different. Then it's not about what do you do with the water that's in the pot. It's how do you turn off the heat,
Oh, I
because
like
the
that.
whole
Yeah.
thing will be, yeah, because the whole thing will just be damaged if you don't.
Right. Yeah. So dealing with overwhelm before it just creates burnout and
Mhm.
overwhelm together is like is really it's just much easier to deal with. So how
Well,
do you actually? Yeah. So I was going to lead into like
no,
how
go
do you
for it. Yeah.
actually deal with overwhelm?
Mhm. See, and this is the interesting paradox, Don, because a lot of the things that I know are true about dealing with overwhelm and dealing with anxiety, because I think that's it's quite similar. Um, that I know now, I knew before I burned out, and I just wasn't willing to do them. So you know, if I think of, like, there's a bunch of stuff. Like let's pick mindfulness. Let's pick mindfulness, presence, meditation, that kind of thing, right? And you know, you may know this. I know that some of the other folks who are listening to this probably know this. I am a relatively new meditator, but I am now a meditator. That's something that I
Hey,
do as part of
congrats.
my practice. Thank you. And I don't worry about whether or not I'm good at it, whatever that means. I just, you know, I know that it's something that is part of my day to day now. And the reason that it's part of my day to day is because there's a centering and a repairing that happens. But the other thing that I know is, when I was in the middle of everything is really, really important and everything requires my undivided attention, and the things that require my undivided attention aren't me, I never would have carved out the time to do that. And I think the quantum leap in there is, if you're not at that point, but you can see the burnout at the end of the tunnel, then what are the things that you're willing to sacrifice so that you do have that time, so that you do have whatever that investment is to put inside, like to go inside rather than outside? Because I think that that's one of the things, at least in my practice and the people that I talk to, it shows up like this a lot. Like, you know, I can't possibly spend 10 minutes a day, 20 minutes a day, whatever, doing this, because I don't have time because there's so many demands on my time. And I guess like maybe a good analogy is going to the gym, right? Like, there's lots and lots and lots of stuff out there about, like healthy people, spend some time exercising their body and making sure that they're, physically fit. And this is really about becoming emotionally fit, isn't it?
I think that's kind of a necessary part of the overwhelm process. And then there's also actions related to it. Actually, a lot of what you're talking about did not end up helping me. Maybe you didn't finish listing things.
Oh,
yeah, we had different experiences because meditation and working out are good things, and I do those now. Actually, it's great, but that's not really what helped me get out of my overwhelm. Because I knew that everybody kind of knows like meditation. Everybody kind of knows working out, but there's actually like in terms of actions, it's kind of obvious what you said. It's like you already knew everything, right? Like take care of yourself, stop taking on like stupid work tasks, or like reduce your load, rest better, like stress less.
Yep.
It's like, okay, fine, like that'd be great, but I'm not willing to do it. And I don't know why I'm stuck on the willingness. So I'm curious how you eventually got the willingness, because that's the real hard part.
I didn't have a choice. Like for me, I didn't have a choice. And in retrospect, I can look at my life now and go, okay, here are the moments when I could have chosen that. And here are the ways that I could have chosen that. Because the other thing that's really true for me, Don, is when I look in my past at the places where I was experiencing anxiety and overwhelm, one of the things that's very true is that in the rearview mirror, none of the situations that I found myself in are as dire as they were in the moment. And that's the story that I was telling myself, right? That was my brain connecting to the alarm in my body, going, this is a really big deal. You need to pay attention to this in a really serious and urgent way because this is a really big deal. So I think, I think the invitation is, what are you worth? And then maybe I think that would have been the question for me. If I were to go back and say, what question could I have asked myself? Like, what are you actually worth? Because the choices are very specific. It's kind of like, it's like when a doctor says, you must change your lifestyle or you will get diabetes. You must stop smoking or you'll get cancer, right? Like it's fairly, like it's a fairly straightforward, thin line that goes there.
Yeah.
And it's a pretty straight line. And maybe you'll avoid it. Maybe you'll be lucky. Maybe you won't get cancer. Maybe you won't get diabetes. Maybe you won't burn out. But probably you will, because that's how it shows up for most people. So what's the point on that line where you want to go, okay, I'm going to do something different than what I've been doing because I want to avoid this thing?
Yeah, that's interesting. I have such a different approach that worked.
Well, I'd love to know. I'd love to know what worked for you.
Yeah. Well, actually, what worked for me is not the same thing that I do with clients, because I didn't have a life coach to help me. Actually, I went through a much harder path than what my clients have to do. Well, for me,
that's kind of why we do what we do, isn't it?
And that's kind of why we do what we do. If it's like just as hard as for you as it was for me without any help, like that means I'm not doing my job right. Yeah. Well, similar to you, I had to. Like, I reached the point of like supreme burn. Like my kettle was black, basically.
Yep.
And I was like, oh God, like I need to do something about this.
Exactly.
And it's just, I finally realized I had a serious problem. And I finally realized I couldn't figure it out on my own. Like, I think that was a lot of it, was finally realizing I couldn't figure it out on my own, and I couldn't just power through it like I have been. Which is a really scary thing to let go of, because my whole life I've been comforting myself. I can do it on my own. If I just push, it'll work. And finally, I realized that's just not enough. Like, it kind of works, but it's not enough anymore.
Yeah.
So the first step for me was getting help, like how the
Yeah.
like how the frick, how the fuck do I
You
actually
can say that.
okay, like how the fuck do I actually fix this? Because I have
Yeah.
no idea.
Yeah. Oh, asking for help is a superpower, and it's unimaginably brave because I'm thinking of my past, Dawn, and all of those times when, the right answer would have been ask for help. And I was like, nope, I can do this. Nope, that's weakness. Nope,
Yeah,
I'm strong enough. I don't need to ask anyone for help. I'm independent.
right.
What
Yeah,
if, just for a split second, I had been open to the possibility, just this much, I'd been open to the possibility of saying, oh, you know what? Maybe you can ask for help.
yeah. And it's funny because I was overwhelmed with being overwhelmed. I was like I didn't know
Yeah,
how to deal with being
it
overwhelmed. It seemed
compounds.
like there would be so much work to deal with being overwhelmed.
Mhm.
It's like this exponential thing that's growing, and
Exactly.
I'm just like if you're trying to fix overwhelm, but you're tackling the overwhelm problem with the same approach that got you into this
Mhm.
troublesome situation in the first place, it's not really going
Mhm.
to work.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
I'm glad I finally surrendered
Yep.
to the fact that I need fucking help. Like I need it,
Yeah.
and that's what changed my life fundamentally.
Mm.
Is when I actually started getting help. Yeah. Um,
I'm glad.
Not to
I'm glad for
say
both of us.
that like there's no way to do it unless you basically like buy coaching and you need help. Like you can't do it on your own.
Mhm.
There are things that we can let them. There are
Mhm.
things to know that will help you with overwhelm like
Mhm.
immediately. I think.
Yep.
What would those things be for
Well,
you,
I
Todd?
I mean, so for me, what I'll say is I got curious. So I started reading, like, what is this thing? What is this thing that I'm experiencing? What does it feel like? And The Body Keeps Score was one of them. There's some other good books. There was one called Judson Brewer is a nerdy neuroscientist who wrote a book called uh, was it Overcoming Anxiety? Yeah, Overcoming Anxiety, which was really, really interesting. That's the thing that led me to mindfulness and meditation as a practice as well. So it was sort of like once my curiosity cracked open a little bit, and once I was able to name what I was experiencing, then it was like, oh, this thing, right? And then it really just sort of became like this crescendo, right? Suddenly I was on the boat, and suddenly it went over the falls.
Right.
Um, and yeah, so there's a whole bunch of things. I think if I were to leave anyone, because I'm looking at the time and we kind of have to wrap this
Yeah,
up a
we
little
do
bit, right?
have 2 minutes left.
But
Yeah.
like if I was leaving folks with one thing, it would be like, well, get curious, because if you're feeling that thing, that maybe it feels like, I'm on the road to a place that I want to go. Like get curious about it. Can you step out of yourself just long enough to be curious about what that thing is? What do you notice?
Mm,
And also, and what would help look like? What do you
yeah.
not want to figure out on your own?
For me, the main takeaway for the audience, I like get curious because
Mhm.
it kind of starts there. I think specifically, I think overwhelm is mostly a willingness problem because you know
Mhm.
what to do. You know
Yep.
that you need to like
Yep.
figure out how to reduce your workload. And secondly, you need to figure out how to be way more productive.
Mhm.
Because if you're way more productive and get more stuff done, then
Mhm.
like your list of like things that are overwhelming you,
Yeah.
it's going to shrink and you can handle it. So
Mhm.
and you kind of know how to be more productive as well. So actually, willingness is mostly a mental thing.
Mhm.
Mental
Boundaries.
things are kind of harder to deal with on your own. But
Mhm.
what you can do is listen to the feeling of overwhelm, like feel where it is in your body,
Yep.
see what it's telling you, and
Mhm.
then lead it. Like as yourself, take into consideration what the overwhelmed part or feeling is telling you, and
For sure.
decide what you want to do with it.
Yep.
And there might be other
Mhm.
parts that come up, like don't do anything about it. Like we're fine. Like there might be
Yep.
resistance, and as Todd said, get curious about that, and just
Yeah.
listen to it. A lot of times when you listen, it'll kind of fade away a little
Mhm.
bit, and then you can
Mhm.
decide what to do.
Yeah. Or it'll have a message. I love that. I think that's really cool. Don, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. I really
Yeah,
enjoyed spending time with you.
that was great.
Yeah, it was. Hey, listen, so if folks want to get a hold of you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Oh yeah, good question. Just follow me on LinkedIn. And if you have
Mhm.
any questions at all about overwhelm or burnout or productivity or career stuff, just send me your question on LinkedIn or just say like, hey, and we can start talking.
Awesome.
I think that could be very helpful to people.
You are very accessible and easy to talk to. So
Wow,
I'm sure people won't struggle
thanks.
with that.
And there's no
Yeah,
tariffs on asking questions
that
because
is true.
yeah,
That is true. No tariffs on asking questions. Thank you, Don. And listen, I'm Todd Karges. You can find me at toddkarges.com or here on LinkedIn or on YouTube. You all know how to get a hold of me. And this has been a discussion about when overwhelm becomes toxic. And thanks. It's important stuff.
yeah. Oh, that was fun. That was great.
Yeah, it was. All right, I'm gonna turn us off.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Don.